So good evening. I'm Sarah Whiting. I'm the Dean. I'd like to take a moment before we start just to share two upcoming public programs here at the GSD still this week. So it's a packed week. On Thursday, Peter Barber, the founder of an award-winning eponymous, I love that word, practice known for their distinctive affordable housing, whom Oliver Wainwright of The Guardian pegged as the miracle creator of dazzling streets, will deliver the 2025 John Dunlop Lecture, which is also our open house lecture on Thursday evening. And then on April 4th and 5th, so on Friday and Saturday, our doctoral students will convene the 2025 Cambridge Talks Conference entitled Arts of Scaling. This conference invites PhD students, postdoctoral students, and postdoctoral fellows, and early career scholars to discuss the parameters, mechanics, and consequences of scalar negotiations or shifts through history. Visit the website to learn more, live stream, RSVP, and all of that. So tonight's lecture by Anne Millet is funded by a generous gift from the Rouse Company, thanks to their former president, Michael Spear, who received his master in city planning from Harvard in 1966. He served on the GSD's visiting committee and was co-chair of the school's advisory committee on real estate development. He helped create the Rouse Fund in 1987 with the aim of, quote, bringing outstanding visual artists to the GSD. The photographer Anne Millet definitely fits the bill of being a, quote, outstanding visual artist, as anyone who saw her exhibit Between Two Rivers at MoMA 2 years ago, or any number of exhibitions she's had at major museums and galleries across the world, would attest. She's also received a MacArthur Award, a Tiffany Foundation Award, a Guggenheim, an NSF when they still existed, and a number of other awards. Professor of photography at Bard College, she received her MFA in photography at Yale after stumbling into photography as an elective while obtaining a biology degree from Stanford. I love that biographical nugget, which should be quite uplifting to any number of our students who come to the GSD from a myriad of undergraduate paths. Born in Vietnam, she fled Saigon with her family when she was 15. Eventually, they settled in the US as political refugees. She returned to Vietnam for the first time in 1994 and used that country's landscape to explore the impact, consequences, and representations of war, ultimately expanding that project to include landscapes as disparate as 29 Palms in California, a site that the military uses for training as a stand-in for Afghanistan and Iraq, and Vietnam reenactment sites in South Carolina. Her more recent work, which I believe we'll see tonight, continues to explore resonances of violence within vast, sublime landscapes. To return to our doctoral students' conference theme of active scaling, Anmi's work scales between the individual position within or individual perception of these landscapes and the vastness of these sites' monumental, almost global scale. I was drawn to her work, as I know you all will be this evening, because of the way she captures both landscape and subject. She uses a large format view camera, which puts her into the very setting that she's photographing. They're hardly discrete spy cameras. Paradoxically, this also hides her as she disappears under a black cloth to do the shoot. It's not new technology. As she notes, it's perfectly okay to use a 19th century tool to explore today's world. It's about how you use it. There are two things that she's said about her how that has struck me. First, that the large format, quote, describes the air and space between things. So like designers of the built environment, she's as sensitive to form as she is to the form of the space between things. Second, and I find this statement to be especially timely, she noted in an interview relatively recently, I think it was last year, she said, "I'm not certain that visual arts can actually change the world, but maybe we can push things along a little bit, one step at a time." And I think that if a picture can make one wonder about certain topics or give you hope that things can be different, it's really about giving attention to the human condition within its complexity, within the darkness. I think it's about meeting the devil halfway. That art and culture can offer up a means of focusing on the human condition within the darkness that surrounds us, That is what I find so very timely, so very valuable, not as a panacea to offer us Pollyannish optimism, but as a reminder that what we all share is humanity. Her photographs encourage us to take the time to reflect upon our shared Earth, upon the realities of what we have done to it and are still doing to it, and to the shared humanity that persists across what might at first seem to be vast cultural and geographic individual divides. Please join me in thanking An Millet for going under the view camera's cloth to capture her extraordinary perspectives, for then working in her studio to bring it to what we will see this evening, and finally, for stepping up to this lectern to share with us what she does to, quote, push things along a little bit, one step at a time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Whiting, for this incredible introduction and for inviting me here today. So I think I can jump straight into photographing in Vietnam. So I got out of graduate school in photography, and like Sarah said, I was not trained as an artist, so going to graduate school in photography was very important to me. I had been making mostly interior photographs of craftsmen studios. I had been working in France quite a bit, so photographing masons and stonecutters doing things, and that was my comfort zone. And I was encouraged to look at the landscape, and it was a total failure. But somehow arriving in Vietnam in the mid-1990s, when President Clinton renewed relations with Vietnam, everything made sense. And I still don't really know how it happened, and it was quite miraculous. Somehow I look at the landscape and I understood how to draw it, how to seize it, and how to kind of capture it. I think somehow I sort of put myself in the shoe of a landscape architect in terms of looking at the way the land is drawn, looking at the separation between earth and sky, and I think most importantly, looking for things that were not there and trying to describe them. Living in exile also means thinking about your culture and thinking about what you did not have access to. So for many years, we did not think we could return to Vietnam. And so once I got there, I just realized that all these memories I had, and the memories are actually, as you know, not very reliable. We tend to remember things we love and enhance them, as well as things that we are terrified of. And so, you know, they are sort of these intuitive guides that I had. I loved looking at things that were handmade. I loved looking at things that didn't seem to be what they are. I loved mystery. And somehow I think picking at those things, I was able to create these landscapes that are kind of almost pre-war. This was my first encounter with the Delta of the Mekong, and I think many of you maybe were too young to remember the end and the fall of Saigon, but I remember distinctively all the news footage of GIs being airlifted from the Delta of the Mekong, winds blowing. We never went into the countryside because it was not safe. And so exploring the landscape was a complete adventure for me. So I came across this landscape, and I wanted to show this one because it shows the limitations of the camera and the kind of accidental happenings that we sort of look for as a photographer, in spite of the fact that the view camera requires a lot of control. I came across this incredible landscape. I didn't have my light meter. I just sort of guessed the exposure time, and for sure I didn't want to underexpose the film, so I exposed it for way too long, and the movements of the trees and everything just started blowing and became so impressionistic. When I got out of graduate school, the kind of photography that was very popular was setup photography, you know, versus Gary Winogrand going out in the street and photographing. So setup photography was favored because it was obvious that there was a kind of authorship into the work that you did. And being the kind of photographer who likes to work in the world, it was sort of very difficult to kind of find my place. But this is what I do, and I continue doing it. But I think people don't really understand, working with a view camera, you do have to construct it. You have to ask people to hold still, you move things around. This is a fictional family, I put them together. But for me, they sort of represent peace and unity and strength in the landscape that did not show those things to me when I was growing up. In terms of trying to give reality to these memories, to these stories I've heard of what it was like to grow up in Vietnam, I think connecting what's old and what's new is certainly a strategy. I think the intimacy of nature, the way I experienced it, was also very important. My grandmother used to sit around chewing betel leaves and areca nuts with her girlfriends, and I never knew how the plants was grown. I just saw a stack of these very luminous green leaves next to her every day. And seeing this garden was a real revelation for me. Going into someone's house and seeing different cultures colliding. French culture, the arrival of Ho Chi Minh. I'm sure the rice cooker is from Korea. So capturing those moments somehow made me feel like I was reclaiming some of my childhood. But obviously the pictures are grounded in the present time, in contemporary Vietnam. That's something that I did not want to deny. But I think that wanting everything taught me how to kind of layer my pictures. I used to think that I wanted to witness things and it was about going out in the world and bearing witness. And I think I realized that I was more interested in having experiences and trying to transcribe them through photography. And this is certainly a picture of an experience that these people had, that I had, that I was interested in somehow transcribing. I spent a number of years working in Vietnam. I was so terrified of that notion of being a tourist photographer, even though I did grow up in Vietnam. I think I spent 5 or 6 years, 1 month at a time, sometimes 3 months. But at the end of this project, it was very clear that I needed to deal with the notion of war. And as a photographer working in the real world, I, by chance, discovered that there were these young men who reenacted the Vietnam War, strangely enough. And I was invited to the reenactments. I wasn't quite sure what I would do with it. And I think that's part of the kind of work I do, in that the subjects, as I feel larger than I am, sometimes they are subjects I don't quite understand, but I still wanted to explore them, or at least start exploring them. So this is sort of what I found, and these are pictures made with a snapshot handheld camera. The landscape is quite incredible. I was interested in the landscape still, even though it seems that it had nothing to do with war, but it's about the notion of the terrain, which is a word I often heard related to Vietnam. It's also about strategies, and so it seemed that focusing on the landscape would be great. I made a large print of this negative, which is a small negative, not from a view camera. I was so disappointed with the lack of physicality, the lack of dimensionality in the print that I considered using the view camera. And there are many photographers who photographed war and conflict using the large format camera. Timothy O'Sullivan during the Civil War, Roger Fenton. Here we have William Jackson, Henry Jackson, a much, much bigger camera. So it kind of inspired me to continue with my tool, but also thinking about photographing before the event, after the event, because with such a camera, it's very difficult to be in the moment and photographing what is most pressing. And in a way, it was a lesson learned, because sometimes the most pressing thing, which is probably more photojournalistic, is not the most interesting. I wanted to also talk about, speaking of those photographers, I think I've been asked often whether, what do I think about the fact that the camera is perhaps a colonial tool? And I think that empires and colonies and enslavement and atrocities flourished way before photography came onto the world stage. And I realized that O'Sullivan, Barnard, Roger Fenton used the large format camera to justify, and his pictures to justify the war in Crimea. Timothy O'Sullivan, his pictures helped the expansion of the American West and the forcible removal of indigenous populations. So I do the same thing, and I do engage with the medium's complicity. But it's really because I believe that it's the type of image that is created with that camera has an incredible eloquence, and it is capable of, I think, for expressing individual body and conscience as it engages with both historical and contemporary moments today. So this is sort of what I found. These are now the real pictures made with the view camera. These reenactors planted bamboo. They tried to recreate, as much authenticity as possible. And I chose this picture because I grew up watching Vietnam War movies, and what really always stood out to me was that, especially early on, none of them were shot in Vietnam. They were shot in the Philippines, they were shot in Malaysia. Full Metal Jacket was shot in London, and the palm trees were brought from North Africa. And I could tell from the color of the rice, from of course, the type of palm trees that were used. And so the landscape was a protagonist for me, and interchangeable. And so here, finding bamboo and Vietnam in North Carolina and Virginia was actually really exciting. Perhaps even more exciting than the reenactors themselves. They do these very intricate setups, and sometimes they're really caught up in playing, quote unquote. And so, often I'd have to find time to work with them later or on another weekend. I would say that the night operations that they had, just using fireworks and exploding kitty litters and things like that, was probably what came closest for me to what I experienced in Vietnam. But nothing else really even came close. And I've had friends who were in the military in Vietnam come and help me, and they agreed that the physicality of it, the attention, the focus, none of it was really close. I had a list of things that I wanted to do as well. It's an exploration. It was not about recreating the Vietnam War or getting those guys to recreate the horror, the tension. I realized that this was a place where I could explore the way the myth of the war, the myth of the country was still so raw and so alive in Americans' imagination, in literature, in books. These guys, knew everything, and they were kind of reliving the stuff that they'd read and that watched in the movies. And so that was interesting to me. So my list came from movies also, The Sniper Girl. I have 4 different versions. This is from The Deer Hunter. I think that this is the one terrifying object or thing that I saw there, the tiger cage, perhaps because it was so spare and so emblematic of so many things by itself, so mysterious also. You could really start imagining the worst. As I was getting a little disenchanted working with those guys. We invaded Iraq, and it was very upsetting. I felt I had to go to Iraq and somehow try to understand what was going on. I felt so much for the young men and women who were being sent to war. I was not able to go, thankfully, and so I found myself going to this Marine air combat training site that's outside of Los Angeles. And, you know, if you didn't know, you would think that this was Afghanistan or parts of Afghanistan. There's a lot of hurrying up and waiting, which is true of the real military. It's all live fire. Something that I started thinking about is, and people ask me, you know, your pictures are so beautiful, you know, what does that mean? You know, and I think that when they say they're so beautiful, I think that they have a kind of superficial understanding of it, like it's pretty or it's landscape. It's the perspective is straight. You show, you know, it's clear. You know, it feels more like Robert Adams photography, but it's about conflict. And so that's when I started reaching for the notion of the sublime and trying to read more about it. I know the sublime is not very popular with artists today because, you know, somehow I think the discussion around the sublime has been tainted by advertising, by the way it has been appropriated by fascism and the Nazis and every totalitarian regimes and even religion. But you know, with that new exhibition of Caspar David Friedrich at the Met, I've been doing some reading about it, and I actually think it's very, very contemporary. This idea of a troubling beauty, this idea of experience something you don't understand that is greater than you, and you just sort of struggle to try to make sense out of it. And it takes you somewhere, and it's sort of unexpected. And it's really kind of the ineffable. And so how do I feel about beauty? I mean, you know, I see it as a kind of clarity. I see it as balance and proportions. But aside from that, you know, I think I'm accepting it. I would say that this is the most sublime experience I've had watching this night operation that occurred. They don't do it anymore. It's all live fire, jets dropping bombs, howitzers, mortars, everything has tracers. You have Marines in the foxholes, their vehicles they're hiding in. My assistant and I, we were the only people outside standing on a berm photographing. It's sublime because it's so disturbing. I think there's something, the devastation, the actual devastation is just unthinkable. So you kind of don't really want to say it's beautiful, but it is. So it's a kind of challenging experience that was beyond anything I could understand, not just what was happening, but also my reaction to it. And I think it's humbling to kind of be in front of something like this. And I think the best I thought I could do was just make sure I made a good picture, that everything was sharp, that it was exposed correctly. And that sort of, you know, being in the presence of something so ineffable is life-changing. Part of the training also turned into something that was more urban. You know, this idea of snipers and Marines going through a city. This was all very early on during the war, and so the settings that the military kind of grabbed on to try to create some kind of authenticity was very slapdash. You know, they would just take abandoned housing and write some graffiti, get some linguist to come and play act. They use the same terms that the reenactors use, you know, scenarios and play actors, and so it's this conflation of the reenactment and this kind of training for war was very interesting to me. And I mean, you train, you keep training, but I don't think you could ever get it right. And some people have passed away during trainings, and so it's about life and death. And it's kind of this liminal space where you train and perhaps the command will change the order and you won't be going to war, or something will happen. And so it's about uncertainty, it's about the past. This is the same place that where Marines trained for Vietnam, and now they're training for Iraq. And it's also about the future. While I was working at 29 Palms, I was invited by one of the colonel there to come and visit his troops in the final part of the training, which took place on a small aircraft carrier off the coast of California. And, you know, I didn't think I wanted to continue with the military. I wasn't sure what I was doing, but I think the notion of going to sea was fascinating to me. And of course, I love Gustave Le Gray, and I thought, okay, I'll go and make Gustave Le Gray, and then I'll go home. The project took 9 years, and it took, I think, a couple of years for me to find this picture, which I think is about Gustave Le Gray. It's about land art. It's about American folly, you know, these military equipments that could be used for making land art. But going to sea was about looking at the military-industrial complex, which is something I'm not sure how you would describe it. So I started looking at fragments of it. I learned this is adjacent, combat adjacent. So it's everything the military does that's not related to direct theater of war. This is during an earthquake relief in 2010. I was always fascinated by this line between the military coming to help and invading. There's something about their body language of the invader versus the helper that is confusing and interesting. You know, this is, again, about the unknown and the sublime. So this is called manning the rail. This is what the military does when they enter a port in a different country. So they get into dress whites, they line around the ship, and it's a kind of salute and presentation of the ship to the country where they're entering. And this is in Indonesia. And for me, it's also the powerful and the less so powerful, the new and the old, it all coming together, and kind of things falling off the horizon, which is destabilizing. I sort of gave myself this limit in that I would go to all the continents where the Navy, the US Navy was involved. So South Pole Station, the Arctic. So the military does care about the way they are seen, of course. And all of these operations that I saw were about hearts and minds and about a kind of advertisement for their strength, you know, peace through strength. They use all these terms. I was not a portrait photographer until I sort of really became taken by all the young women who worked in the military. Now women are in combat, but back then, you know, they had just been accepted on aircraft carriers and they were going to be accepted on submarines. And it's about how the individual asserts itself in different ways while trying to do their jobs and while trying to fit or stand out within the military structure. This picture always bothered me a little bit at the beginning because it seems so on the nose, and it made me think of Robert Frank's picture of the nanny, the black nanny with a white baby in The Americans. But I've come to peace with it too. It's about maybe spirituality. This is on an American hospital ship off the coast of Vietnam. And the nun is a patient, and the sailor was my guide. I wanted to photograph her and somehow just put them next to one another. And I think it's really about how objective photography is in its power to describe something. You know, the details in the uniform, the colors, the metallic sheen of the surroundings, the chairs and the curtains. But at the same time, it's really about what that experience of seeing, you know, with your visual eye, with your physical eye, how that becomes a kind of mental eye and a kind of subjective experience, you know, what's beyond the frame, you know, thinking about peace and war, thinking about these two different institutions, and maybe thinking about how perhaps they wanted that they both have their hands together, but maybe it's about connectedness as well, in spite of that huge space in between them. In 2005, so when I finished Events Ashore, you know, just like you guys know what it means to be at the end of a project and kind of struggling to find something else, I was invited on the set of this big Hollywood film called Free State of Jones, and it was being shot in Louisiana about the Civil War. And it was extraordinary. You know, I think it was another facet of recreating a reality, of training, acting to get it all right, to get something to look real, to get, it wasn't that unfamiliar, but it was a kind of different set of rules that I had to play with. I love the pictures, but I didn't really think that they were interesting on their own. At the same time, I received a commission to do something outside of the set in the South, and this was when the Confederate monuments started being contested. And I kept going back and forth to Louisiana. I kept missing the removal of the monuments, and eventually, so it's good that I missed the removal, because then it forced me to figure out how to photograph them, and I got into the storage place. This is Robert E. Lee and Beauregard, who was in the previous picture. Election year, it felt to me that there was so much unrest, so much misunderstanding. The language, everything was so simplified, all the discussions, the debates. I think that it was explosive, and I felt that war was coming home, and I think whatever it was that made me find agency photographing the military, I found agency photographing at home. And so this project is still going on, and it's a kind of reimagined road trip. And you know, I love Robert Frank and Stephen Shore and Joel Sternfeld, and never felt, as much as I admired the work, I never felt implicated. And so this is sort of a kind of personally reimagined road trip. So they're kind of like hot button topics. You know, again, I'm not a photojournalist, and I'm often missing the main event. So it is about what did the event, how do I feel about the event, and what kind of secondary or picture that I could make that would somehow bring something new to the moment. Of course, the issues about immigration on the borders, so I went to the Central Valley to photograph the migrant workers. I went to the border. And these are border protection officers. And it's I think, in a way, these portraits show how complicated it is because she's a Mexican custom border protection officer standing on the Mexican, beyond the yellow line, which is the border, standing on the Mexican side of the bridge. And here we have the American one who's actually Mexican-American. I wanted to go to the White House, but was not able to until much, much later, so I was able to get on the set of SNL, which I think, in a way, is really interesting, the kind of apparatus of power, it's the carpet, and it's the gold curtains, and, of course, the paintings and the little sculptures and the tchotchkes on the desk, but nothing else. COVID, so we had a naval hospital ship that actually came to New York. It was not a very successful enterprise. George Floyd, and still during COVID and protest, I came across this moment right outside of, across from the White House. And I did get into the White House, and this is the, and I think this picture is so relevant right now still. This is the press briefing room, which is tiny. You always see it from the other side, from the press podium. The postal workers, it was about also election by mail. I would say that my work is quasi-documentary. I'm interested in the aspect of photography that brings it close to literature and poetry, especially poetry. It's not a perfect analogy, but I would say that the building blocks of language and the building blocks of the world, which is what I used, and the way poets put it together, the way photographers put it together, is very similar. In poetry, you have rhythms and enjambments, and you have repetitions. In photography, it's about connecting things because you're standing in a particular way. It's about creating tension. It's about perspective. And I think that we come really close when it's about trying to work on form and content. I think we, both poets and photographers, really care about that. This is about the Dobbs case. I photographed so many protests, and I just didn't know what to do. And my daughter, who was in the early college, high school, was studying for her Supreme Court class, and she was studying the case. And all these books were, it's about women and young women and the future. These pictures where, I had always sort of spent many years of my life as a photographer juggling the rectangle, like how do you fit something in there? What do you include? What do you exclude? Where's the tension? What are you suggesting that's not in the frame? And I got a little tired of that, and for Silent in General, I started putting a series of pictures together, 3 or 4, or 4 or 5. And if you knew that a number of pictures were together, how do you read them together, and what does it all mean? And it was kind of interesting, but it was sort of a first step to kind of get out of the box of the rectangle, but in a way that was thoughtful. And I think the next step was around 2022, I returned to 29 Palms just for a quick visit. And in the past, all the trainings had been in front of me. And here, I would say, so now, 20 years later, the exercises are more international. I was on a hill, and everything was happening around me. And it was much more multidisciplinary. They had helicopters and troops and tanks and targets, and I felt that taking single pictures just didn't do the job. And so I walked away very frustrated and came up with this idea that maybe the next project could be something that is circular and more immersive. And I took great inspiration with Vanderlin's panorama at the Met, in the American wing. If you guys haven't seen that, you should really go see it. It's extraordinary. I was all ready to kind of stitch things together and try to create a kind of seamless landscape until I came across this old book of Robert Adams's work called Listening by the River, I think, that was sitting in my studio, and I just flipped through the pages, and I wasn't thinking anything, but I kept flipping through, and there we go, the horizon line, the pictures have not, they're not connected, but there's obviously a thought there. And so it made me think that perhaps it would be more challenging to actually not connect the images and not do something seamless. And so this is what I came up with. And it's really interesting because it's the cyclorama was something that was very popular before the moving image was invented. It was a tool for entertainment. You know, groups of people could come and see something and socialize. It was a colonial tool. It was a way to promote colonial expansion. It was also used in prison, you know, the opticon, kind of centralizing power in the middle, the prisoners in a circular structure around it. And so this was kind of historically interesting to kind of use something that was so meaningful. And in terms of subject matter, it was kind of autobiographical. So I went to Vietnam, I went to France and Louisiana, which is a place that has a lot of Vietnamese communities, and made this kind of mash. I don't do much commercial work. This is 15 minutes to the end of the lecture, or 15 minutes to my 50 minutes. Oh my God. Okay. All right. So I don't do a lot of commercial work, but I did this long-term, very long project for the New York Times opinion page on our nuclear arsenal. So these are Minuteman silos from aerial views. This is, you know, it's all on these sort of farmlands in Nebraska, in Montana. They're kind of anonymous. You don't really notice them, and it's really terrifying. So I kind of what's the word? You know, nabbed on that commercial work to do something for myself. Actually, it was my idea to do the aerial views, and so I created another cyclorama with the aerial views of the nuclear sites. And I wanted something else to offset the structure and the subject of nuclear power, and looked at the sky, because I think that it's nuclear power and the harnessing of solar power is so connected. And so these are about civilization and a look at the infinite world that's beyond us. This was started before the election, but in a way, I think it's kind of a right time to kind of look for answer and perhaps a little bit of comfort out in the cosmos. So maybe I'll stop here. I was going to show some of the embroideries I made, but you know, I wanted to have time for questions. So.
Thank you. I want to start to sort of take the first question, just to ask about that. Maybe it goes back to one of the quotes that I cited from you. Your interest in capturing the space between things and the amount of space that you give in your photographs, whether it's to sky, and that's very obvious, especially in the black and white photos, that you see the amount of space in the photograph that's to the sort of blankness of sky and the grayness of sky. But even interior shots often, even ones that have crowded scenes, often have a lot of space in them. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about your formation of space.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I don't want the information I'm interested in to exist in a vacuum. I think it's important to give it context. And I always tell my students, well, you're interested in something, right? So you're going to stand there. Well, try to take one step back and see whether you can still maintain attention, because if you can, that means you added more information and you're making the picture more complicated. Obviously, at one point you would have gone too far back and everything's falling apart, or suddenly your point of interest has been engulfed by something else. But it's that play between things, and I think that's why I think about landscape design a lot, in that, you know, how do you suggest a kind of human endeavor within a larger cosmos, within the world, within stuff that we can't control sometimes. And I think maybe it gives a little bit more urgency to the human endeavor. Maybe it will make the military endeavor seem futile. Maybe it's about connecting something smaller with something larger. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have mics running. Yep.
Oh. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. It's really remarkable to listen to look at your images, but also to listen to you. So thank you. I was thinking about the fact that the Vietnam War is very commonly referred to as the first war that landed in our living rooms.
Yes.
And I was thinking about your work and trying to figure out if there's a particular room, so to speak, and I'm using that word sort of suggestively as opposed to literally, where you anticipate your work landing. Where does this, it's kind of where's your audience, but where does this sit societally for you, the work that you're doing?
Well, I think it sits in a different space than the photojournalism work, and it's the work that I know, the images that are kind of seared in my head, and so it's a kind of adjacent work that hopefully will make you think. You know, we think of war and devastation, we think of combat and deaths, but you know, there are other things. You know, there's preparation for war, there's the consequences of war, and I think that what really moved me and upsetted me when the war started, when we invaded Iraq, was I knew with advances in medicine that fewer soldiers will die, but you know, many more will be maimed and injured, and not just them, but also the way it affected their families and the community. So it's like the way it kind of reverberates within a larger community. And so thinking about all of that, I think, was upsetting. It's you know, I think hoping that we'll take those decisions even more seriously. It's also about giving a voice to the soldiers. You know, I think that when the Vietnam War ended, the vets were not acknowledged. There was no closure to the war. It seemed like it was something that just kind of continued, you know. So I think it's just not only about the Vietnam War. It's about conflict in general, and it's about, I think, the notion that one should talk about complicated subject and not try to reduce it to a simplification. You know, it's not about winning or losing, who won or who lost, but it's about the reverberation, the impact of it, and that we should always, you know, I think there are assumptions. We have assumptions about beauty, about conflict. I had assumptions about the enemy, you know, somehow going down and working with the re-enactors, kind of something shifted for me. So I think it's about making us be more open-minded.
Thank you.
How do you make a picture? And by that, I mean your portraits are phenomenal, but how do you get close enough to the people so that they will affect what you want to find in them?
Well, I think about portraits a lot because it's not my strength. I think there's something about the view camera in that people present themselves to it, right? Because it's there, it's not in front of my face, I'm standing next to it. They know they're going to have to pose and hold still for a little bit. They're formal, but I like that, you know. Some people say, oh, this is so stiff, or some students say, oh, I prefer the more. But it's about connecting with a human being. It's about trying to understand something about them, but it's subjective, of course. And so I think that I see something about them, and in this particular case, it worked because I was attuned to the woman in the military. And you just have to kind of get them to relax, but not relax too much, but also focus on you or focus on the camera. So it's hard to say how it works, because at times I feel like this is going to be great and it's not good. And then other times I make a portrait and I don't even remember it, and then I look at the contact sheet and I say, oh my God. And it happens a lot in photography, you know, because there's a bit of serendipity, there's all kinds of things that happen.
Hey, hi. Thank you so much for the lecture. It was super powerful, and you're very soothing in how you talk, so appreciate that. It particularly resonates with me because I'm also Vietnamese American. My mom grew up in Hanoi during the war. My dad was building boats for the Navy in the South. But my question is maybe trying to bridge architecture and photography, because I think there's a lot of similarities between, you know, our images or our currency as architects, our images, which are increasingly becoming more real. So the question is maybe related to simulation. So, you know, struck by all the sort of scenes which you've kind of simulated or reenacted, and when you look at them at face value, you don't really know, like, is this real or not?
Right.
So maybe it's more of an observation, but do you feel like today, as we can increasingly not tell what is real, especially with AI, for example, like, how should, say, designers navigate this maybe? Should there be more of a call for, say, abstraction and representation? Just some of your thoughts on this would be great.
What do you mean by abstraction in?
Like, for example, maybe to convince, say, a client as an architect, they're more compelled when they see something that looks extremely crisp and real. Whereas maybe 20, 30 years ago, we were relying on representation that was more abstract.
Right, drawings and models.
Yeah, or like, you know, renderings by hand that were painterly, for example.
I mean, the thing that I do, and I hope it would make sense, is that, you know, that sense of describing the real world and then somehow something objective and somehow try to suggest something that's subjective. And I think it only works if you are really dedicated to describing what you see or the things that matter in the most precise way. You know, like hatch marks, you know. I think of Thea Selmans with, you know, her little pencil and laboring over drawing a stone. And it's about that. I think if you commit to that, and then there's a kind of nebulous equation there, somehow things just kind of open up. And maybe, you know, when you do AI, it becomes kind of too unreal to give the person an experience. So it's about experience, like how do you provide a great experience to your client, right? So I think you have to just figure out the right tool, just as much as I want my viewer to kind of get lost in the details, the moment, the reality of it, but then also escape. I hope I answered your question.
Good. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. I can hear you. Yeah. Oh.
Hi. I wanted to proceed with this formulation of the witness that you introduced earlier. I know you've moved beyond this, but your work for me has always been about the positionality of the photographer. And I'm perhaps I'm wrong in stating this, but I was under the impression that one of the early series you made, you were assigned the role of sniper. Was this correct? In
The Vietnam War.
Yes.
Yes.
Which is an interesting aesthetic and moral, ethical position, which is different than, say, the witness.
I was not assigned. I chose.
I chose. And I think for me, what's interesting, at least about this earlier position that you choose for yourself, witness, and then later a sniper, is a sniper inflicts harm, or at least it's implicated in a sort of logic of harm or violence, whereas the witness for me is, assumes an entirely different valence. I'm curious how, as you move through these positions, it has changed the way that you think about photography as an aesthetic discursive operation.
Well, even as a sniper, I was witnessing, and I chose the sniper for practical reasons because it allowed me to start with the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese Army, and then, part of their complex scenario, I was captured and brought onto the other side. And that was the only way to go back and forth between the two camps. But, what I mean by bearing witness is that I think I'm always there looking at something and experiencing it and having the camera focused onto that moment. But I think what I meant was that I think I used to say that I miss my calling and I could have been a war photographer, and it's about going out in the world and seeing new things. But it's not just seeing new things. It's seeing new things, experiencing them, and then not just photographing the moment, but somehow try to retranscribe that experience. Because I think sometimes you see things and you photograph them, but I don't think you really think about the experience itself or the mystery of that moment. I think it's usually something that I didn't quite understand that was kind of enigmatic.
Hello. Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm particularly interested in the notion of permission, or maybe permission versus forgiveness. Photographing the army, you obviously had to have an official permission to be even on site. Then the border portraits, you must have said something very compelling to them for them to accept to be photographed. Then the protest is just about not being in the way. And then the landscape is maybe total freedom, or maybe not. So that's kind of an observation. And then how much do you reveal about your past work when you go on site like this, especially maybe with the border portraits? Or your current project that you're undertaking, your intention with the work? Or is it just about making yourself invisible versus being a stage designer or something?
Yeah, but the permission is a big deal. It's a lot of work, but my work is not about that, And I think that, in a way, there are no secrets in the world. I think it was Oppenheimer who said there are no secrets in the world, only men have secrets. Something like that. I'm completely paraphrasing. So, there's certain things I want to see, and I work hard, and sometimes I don't get it, so I try to find something else. And often the thing that I find, because I didn't get to the first thing, is actually better, because it's adjacent, So it's less obvious, and you have to work harder, and it's more subtle, and maybe it's more complex. When I meet people. Well, now everything's online, so it's really hard to hide, right? But I think, and maybe I'm a romantic, artist. I've kind of realized that from doing some reading on Friedrich. It's about describing things and providing the experience and then letting people decide. So my work is actually understood so differently depending on where it's shown. And something that you think may be disturbing, someone else, somewhere else, will find it kind of beautiful and heartening. So, the portraits may be destabilizing for you, but I think the women actually really like them. I think the pictures from 29 Palms, I've heard people say, oh, this is an incredible, especially the film that I made that I didn't show. It's such an anti-war statement. But then I've heard other people say elsewhere in the country that, you know, it's so patriotic and the young men look so heroic, you know, and that it was for war. So, and it doesn't disturb me, but I'm interested in those different points of views, and I'm interested in people kind of forming their own subversive, not subversive, subjective interpretation.
Hi. Thank you for an amazing lecture. My question is along how do you make a picture, and also maybe the immersiveness and the distance or your position within the field. I'm particularly curious, like, how do you, like, at some point it seems to me that you're fully immersed in that sort of simulated reality, but at the same time, I feel like you're constantly stepping back to see how much the tension is holding and to what extent, and where the repercussions, where the edges of the repercussions are. Like, how do you navigate the distance? Like, how do you, like, sometimes become fully immersed, maybe even forget that you are there or your camera is there? Or how do you, and sometimes how do you, like, really step back and just think?
Yeah, photography is a weird thing, especially with the view camera, because you get into this zone. And it's not from being under the dark cloth. I'm actually under it not as much, you know, standing next to it and kind of seeing what's in front of me and deciding where the camera should be. And it gets completely, I get so focused. I've stepped on anthills before and not even noticed. And sometimes I don't hear what's going on. But when you photograph, so you decide what your subject is, kind of, you know, or the outline of a subject. I decide where I want to go. So once I'm there, I try to be as intuitive as possible, you know, and really make the pictures. It's problem solving. Like you said, where do you stand? How much horizon line? How do you describe this and that? If you stood over here, maybe those two things will come closer and creates that tension. If you go up higher, you can see more. If you're lower, you're kind of into it, right? So you decide all those things without thinking about what it really means, because you don't have time. So it's later, after you come back and you look at all your contact sheet and you do the editing, that's when the big decision happens. And I think you learn from it. You make the mistakes, or you feel, oh, I didn't get that right. Somehow, the next time, you'll get it right. So it's that mixture of a really intuitive, very quick judgment work on the field, and then, you know, pre-research and afterwards editing. But, you know, I walk away from a situation often asking myself, did I do everything I could have done? Did I ask that person the right thing? Did I over-direct something? Or, you know, it's always about, what didn't you do, you know? And it's always fun. I mean, no matter how hard I have to work to get permission, once I'm out there, that's why I do it. It's sort of like I get, you know, my heart just beats, and it's just like, oh my God, I gotta, you know.
Thank you for the lecture. I kind of like want to perhaps, maybe this is also just an observation, but you know, because you know, one of the things that I find very fascinating about your work is this kind of like tension between, I guess, you know, like there's like this idea of like objectiveness in the work that you describe, but it also like there's like this subjective construction, and even like, you know, with like the way of like you use the camera, the particular type of camera, that forcing people to like, I guess, you know, be self-aware and kind of like posing that. And even like, you know, like, even like in like composition, there's like this tension between like, you know, the vastness of a landscape. There's like a big disparity in scale. And perhaps, I don't know, like whether you could speak more about like how you play out that tension, because, you know, it clearly is not really about like achieving any kind of like balance, because, you know, it's, and I wouldn't say that balance, it's like there's something quite, I guess, haunting about it. And perhaps, that haunting aspect for me, there's like some kind of, I don't know, like a specter of like history, or maybe some kind of like the unreliability of memories that kind of play onto that.
I don't know, but I think that when I'm making the picture, I don't think about anything except how to problem solve. I think, of course, because of who you are, you respond to certain things, right? You see this thing, and that's what you want to photograph. And I think if you and I were in the same place, you would stand here, and I would stand here. And you would make your perfect picture, and I would make my perfect picture. So I think whatever haunts you and helps you decide where you want to go. But in terms of picture making, it's picture making. And I think the view camera does make it seem like it's a little off, right? Because it's still, because it's, time upon time, it's a long exposure, so there's something about it. But that helps create a larger negative that makes a print that is actually has physicality. So, I want people to spend time looking at the picture. So, it has to hold attention. So you can, my pictures are actually not huge compared to Jeff Wall or the Germans. It's medium sized, but they're big. So if you stand far back, you can actually see the entire image. If you step close, you can actually see, the fold of somebody's shirt, and and it's actually sharp. So there's a kind of reward there, between seeing the whole thing and seeing the details. I think that kind of forces me or makes me want to make this kind of picture. I'm trying.
Thank you, Anmi, so much for walking us through so much of your work. My question is about a part of your life that you haven't talked about here today, and that's sort of your other creative half as a teacher. And I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about how you came to teaching, and whether you can speak to kind of any relationship between your philosophical approach to pedagogy and your approach to your artistic practice.
Well, thank you for asking that question. I am also an accidental teacher. I never spoke in graduate school. We had one of the main teachers is so well-spoken, and he would often correct us if we misspoke, and somehow I felt self-conscious that he was always correcting me. But I never spoke during graduate school, or unless I had to. So the idea of teaching was the last thing on my mind. But somehow it just happened. I think Stephen Shore saw some of my work in an exhibition, and he said, "Do you want to come teach?" And it seemed like a job, that had flexibility, and I needed a job, so I did it. And I think that I didn't really become a good teacher until I had children. I think that they made me more empathetic in terms of understanding what a student was going through, the difficulties perhaps they have in understanding things or not bringing homework. For me, it's like, if you don't do this and this and this, and Stephen has a very strict program, you have to bring in a certain amount of work, and I'm all for it. I work hard, I have work ethics. And so, it made me much more empathetic. And I think more recently, and I never spoke about my own work for the longest time, because it seemed that no one was interested in what I was doing. Who would want to go work at the military? So I would critique their work, and I would bring, great criticism, but I think more recently, I realized that so much of what I do is actually helpful for them. And so I've started speaking more about what happens when I'm out in the field. I speak a lot about failure, how you learn from failure. I didn't think it mattered to them. I always thought, oh, it's my own thing, why would they care? And I also see teachers who kind of want their students to do the kind of work they do, which is definitely what I think my goal is to try to help a student do what they want to do the best possible. So I've started to bring in so much more of what I've experienced and what I've learned, working as a photographer, and also, I hate using the word career, but in my career, what happens? Often students say, but I got the show, but nothing has happened since. And I say, oh, welcome to the world. It takes time. And I tell them, for example, that the first 3 bodies of work I made, no one was interested in, so I was actually able to make the 3 bodies of work, and it helped me understand, about this idea of thinking historically, and how connected Vietnam is to the small wars, to 29 Palms. And I think success early on sometimes can be a problem. But yes, I've become, I think, a much better teacher. I wanted to say something else that is actually important, and I don't know why I didn't mention it, is that what was crucial for me when I arrived in Vietnam was that I think that war changes everything, but somehow I felt that the war and destruction did not change the landscape, that I was able to, whether the past was invisible, I could see it, and that somehow it's stratified. And I think you meet someone, I couldn't see the past in them, an older person as well. I couldn't see the culture, I couldn't see some of the customs I was interested in, but I could see it in the landscape.
Hello. Thank you for the lecture. This question is regarding the panoramic series that you showed. Briefly, when I saw some of the samples that you had, there was a large landscape that was present throughout many of them. And within that, there seemed to be a wide variety of scales that were present in the photography. And I'm curious, my question is, was there a narrative that you had? I know that you explained that there was the silos, but when you go around looking through your images, when you go to find those specific pieces, was there a narrative you wanted to share? Were there specific details that you typically look for to kind of help give a story to the viewer?
You mean, how do I find my landscape?
Or how do you build it with so many pieces, and knowing that there's many levels of detail that are present in each of the photographs?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right.
No, could you explain it, ask me in a different way?
Sure. So what stood out to me when I saw the panoramic series, there was a landscape that was present throughout them all. And within that, there were many details that could be seen. I imagine when we're up close, there's much more to see at a smaller scale. And so my question is, when you're looking at the whole photograph and you want to piece them together,
Yeah.
You mentioned that in the silo series that you wanted to focus on the Minutemen silos.
Yeah,
and so in some of the other projects that you had, did you also have other narratives that kind of helped inform what you were looking for specifically in photos, or was it, I'm just curious on that process.
Yeah, I think for the area views, it was trying to represent, the silos and the control centers, and I certainly wanted, some sort of farmland that didn't have anything. I also wanted some traces of agriculture. And it was also about tilting the horizon line to kind of give the sense of what it means to be in a helicopter and having that kind of experience. And, I think the destabilization of the experience. But I think that often I would see something that is really interesting, and I'm always afraid that it's too obvious. And maybe that's my bad. And so I step back. And so that thing is within something else. And I keep stepping back, and it's within, it's kind of like the Russian doll, it just keeps. And at some point, that first doll is just too small. But, with the view camera, you can actually describe things with specificity, like in a pretty remarkable way. But it's also, and I think the dean mentioned that sense of the air between things, So with the view camera, things don't just stack up in a print, You actually feel the space in between each thing as they are lined up one behind the other. It's pretty extraordinary. And I think with the 8x10 view camera, it's even more evident. You know, my camera is just 5.7, but it already shows.
Hi, sorry, I've been waiting for a minute.
I keep hitting this thing.
Hello, thank you for your time today. I'm really interested in your embroidery works. Would
Yes.
you be able to talk more about
Oh, yes.
about them and the
All right.
themes of
So we have time? Yeah, so 20 years ago, and probably because I was asked the question, do you fetishize the military? Or sometimes, oh, it seems that you glorify the military. But the word fetishism kind of stuck with me. And perhaps because of that, and it was also the early years of the internet, and I was working with the Vietnam War reenactors, and I thought a lot about how much effort they put into their uniforms. Some of them learned how to sew them, and they talked about first generation uniforms and this and that, and it was a real care for what they wore and this fetishism of the uniform. So I think perhaps because of that, then I started doing crazy research and came across this porn video. I think it's from the 90s. It's called Gangbang Number 26, which meant that this was the 26th video. And it was extraordinary because it spent quite a bit of time in the landscape. So you have these young men dressed as Vietnam-era GIs walking through the landscape, so a small platoon. And then they crossed this village. It was constructed out in the landscape, and these two women, and I guess I have this picture because it's not that I'm not thinking about you know, what happened in Vietnam. I'm not sure how to say that. But anyway, so these two young women arrive on a red moped, and this is a still from Full Metal Jacket. So it was fascinating that somehow seeped into this porn video. There's nothing, you know, it's just a gangbang, but whatever. It had everything that interested me. I'm sorry. This is difficult to talk about. It had a reenactment of the Vietnam War. It had landscape, it had uniforms, it had soldiers, Asian women, and so I didn't know what to do. I think I was overwhelmed. It was I couldn't deal with it, so I put it away for at least 10 years. And I knew that it was important, that it had potential. I just didn't know what to do with it. And eventually, I thought that the best way perhaps would be to transform them into these embroideries. So the two large ones that are made in Vietnam, because I would not be capable of making something so large in my studio, are done by 4 or 5 Vietnamese embroiders, and embroidery is a big deal in Vietnam. And so embroidery was interesting to me because of the way it broke down the image. I took stills from the porn, printed them on canvas, and then embroidered on top. And I think eventually I left some parts unembroidered. But it's just how the mark making, the stitching, broke up the image. If you look close, you only see the stitching. You have to step back in order to see the images. So why? So how is this important? So it's important because I think that it talks about this ecstatic sublime, right? It's perverse. It's about it's carnal. It's about ecstasy. It's kind of quasi-religious, and it's about an experience that I could not understand, and to put it out on this thing. So it talks about labor, right? Whether it's sex work. Well, I think very few sex workers do porn, but I think it's about porn workers and how women hustle during the war, how they're vulnerable, like children are vulnerable, but women hustle during the war, and this is what they do. it's about how terrible that these people took a moment in history to turn it into entertainment. It's about authenticity, which is, I think, something that runs through the rest of my work. But it's also by slowing it down. It's counterintuitive with porn, which is kind of fast and you kind of digest it. This is much more indigestible, if that's the right word, or indecipherable. And so each one of these are a chunk of time. So they have a timestamp. I think you can tell that they take hours and hours of work. And so they kind of are objects that have a compression of space, a compression of time, and I think a compression of history and different modes of interpreting history, reworking history. So I'm still not completely sure I understand the experience. I think what was interesting to me was that I started working more like a painter. The first ones are more about getting the colors right, and then developing a color palette. And I chose moments that are not the typical porn pictures. You could say this is the witnessing figure that you see in Friedrich's work. So it's so I think they talk about all of the adjacent things that we think about war in terms of pillage of wars and violence against women and vulnerability of children and women and kind of this unending war. And the relationship between Eros and Thanatos. I don't know. Okay.
Thank you.